Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Tennessee Hollows. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The record begins in 1883 in a deep, damp valley of eastern Tennessee where the fog never truly lifts. Locals still call it the Hollows, though the name has slipped from official maps. That year, the land was still healing from the southern floods of 1882, when the Cumberland and its tributaries overran their banks and carried away entire farms. County clerks in nearby Claymore wrote that whole deeds were erased by the river. It's one reason why so much about what happened next remains fragmented, washed out of memory as completely as it was from the ledgers. Among the settlers returning to reclaim what they could was a man named Elias Shepherd. By all surviving accounts, he was tall, quiet, and carried a preacher's worn Bible, though he was no ordained man. He arrived with a new wife, his third, named Lucinda May, described as a pale and nervous woman, always glancing back over her shoulder. The couple purchased, or perhaps simply occupied, a parcel of land near the Hollows Bend, where an earlier homestead had collapsed into the floodwater. The property was bordered by an oak grove that, to this day, no one cuts for timber. The surviving township records note that by autumn of 1883, Elias Shepherd was regarded as a fair hand with mules and a punctual payer of debts. Yet something about him sat uneasily with neighbors. He was seldom seen in daylight. Most of his work, wood cutting, fence mending, even digging, was done under lantern light. Old Mrs. Dunworth, a midwife who lived 2 ridges over, told a surveyor years later that she would sometimes hear iron striking earth long after the whippoorwills had gone silent. When winter came, the Shepherds ceased attending church. Their cabin chimney gave no smoke for days. Then, early one March, a new woman appeared beside Elias at the post office. Younger, auburn-haired, called herself Miss Cora, wearing a plain ring. Lucinda, the previous wife, was never mentioned again. When questioned, Elias told the clerk she had taken ill and gone to kin in Franklin County. No one pressed further. Many families, after the flood, scattered and were never heard from again. But it did not end there. Over the next decade, the same pattern repeated itself, with grim rhythm, a new Mrs. Shepherd arriving every few years, each more withdrawn than the last. None were ever seen leaving. When asked about their whereabouts, Elias offered varying explanations. One had gone home to Alabama. Another had drowned in the swollen creek. Another still had run off west with a peddler. His tone never changed. The constable of that era, a man named Abner Doss, recorded in a letter to the county seat, "Shepherd keeps to himself. There is rumor of graves upon his land, but I find no crime without a witness." The truth is that law in those valleys was as thin as the mist that clung to them. The nearest court sat 2 days' ride away, and most settlers preferred not to invite official attention. The Hollows were a place where misfortunes were buried quietly, where widows remarried before the dirt on their first husband's grave had settled. So it wasn't until 1895, 12 years after Elias first arrived, that anyone truly began to question the whispers. That summer, a drought revealed what the flood once concealed. The creek behind Shepherd's property ran low, exposing roots, bones of livestock, and something that didn't match the rest. 2 boys fishing for perch found a length of fabric, faded blue calico, tangled around what they thought was a deer's skull. When they pulled it free, the jaw was unmistakably human. Within days, the sheriff rode out from Claymore, accompanied by a young doctor named Thomas Rowe. They questioned Elias, now older, grayer, his hands trembling. He invited them in without resistance, even offered them water from his well. When asked about the remains, he said simply, "This land holds what the flood left behind." The search that followed lasted 3 days. In that time, 6 more shallow depressions were found within the oak grove, 7 in total, each with faint traces of linen, women's buttons, and hair. The doctor's notes, preserved in a mildewed ledger, described the soil as disturbed repeatedly over years. No coffins, no markers, Only stones placed in precise triangles, almost ritual in spacing. Elias Shepherd was taken into custody, though not formally charged. The sheriff's wagon overturned on the muddy road returning to town, and Elias claimed a broken leg, which confined him to a cot in the jailhouse. While he lay there, he asked for his Bible, the same one he'd carried since first arriving. Inside the back cover, tucked between the Psalms, was a list written in neat, faded at Mary 1878, Eliza 1880, Lucinda 1883, Cora 1887, Ruth 1890, Margaret 1892, Hester 1894, 7 names, 7 years, 7 wives. No witnesses ever came forward. No surviving kin claimed the women. When asked where they were from, Shepherd merely said, "Each came to me as the Lord provided, and the Lord saw fit to take them." When the county sent word to verify his claims, they found no trace of any of the women, not in birth records, not in census lists, not even among the displaced victims of the 1882 floods. It was as if the river had not only carried away the dead, but the memory of the living. And so, the case of Elias Shepherd, the man with 7 wives and 7 graves, began not with confession, but with silence. The first night after Elias Shepherd's arrest, the people of Claymore gathered outside the jailhouse, as if drawn by some grim curiosity. The lamp in his cell burned until dawn, though the sheriff swore no one had given him oil. Inside, Elias sat upright, murmuring passages from the book of Job. "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away." Those who passed by said they could hear him reciting it again and again, as if he were defending himself to something unseen. The county coroner, Dr. Thomas Rowe, pressed to begin a formal examination of the remains found on Shepherd's property. Yet there was hesitation from the court clerk, Mr. August Pelham, who reminded the sheriff that Claymore had no proper holding ground for evidence of this nature, and no funds to transport bodies. So the investigation unfolded slowly, in candlelit barns and borrowed parlors, each discovery recorded in brittle ink on damp paper. Rowe's initial notes are all that survive today. Bones consistent with adult females. Approximate burial intervals suggest repeated events over 10 years. No evidence of trauma visible. Soil pattern consistent with deliberate placement. His language was cautious, clinical, almost detached. But in the margin, beside the final line, he had scribbled one word, arranged. That word, arranged, lingered in the imagination of the townsfolk. Some whispered that the graves formed a symbol, others that they were laid out to follow the stars visible above the hollow in midsummer. When a surveyor was brought in to measure, his rough sketch indeed showed a peculiar symmetry, a circle of 7, surrounding a dead oak stump in the center. Whether it was design or coincidence, none could say. Meanwhile, Elias kept to his Bible and spoke little. His only visitor was a young woman named Clara Dunworth, daughter of the midwife who had once heard those midnight strikes of iron. Clara brought him bread and a letter of prayer, though she confessed later to her minister that she only wished to see the eyes of a man rumored to have married 7 times. She described them as gray, not cruel, but hollow, as though the world behind them had gone dark long ago. On the 3rd day of confinement, the sheriff found Elias unresponsive. The physician declared it a stroke brought on by stress and fever. He died before sunrise, never having given a confession. When they searched his cell, they found beneath his cot a small pouch containing strands of hair tied with twine. One lock dark, one fair, one red, all brittle with age. With the accused dead, the case should have closed, but it did not. Questions multiplied. The land itself seemed unwilling to release its secrets. The oak grove remained, and so did the graves. Some in Claymore insisted the sheriff rebury the women properly. Others feared disturbing them again would bring misfortune. In the end, a compromise was reached. The site was fenced off and recorded as private burial grounds, owner deceased. Dr. Rowe returned several months later with new determination. He had begun corresponding with a geologist from Nashville who had studied how the 1882 southern floods altered soil composition across Tennessee. Rowe believed that the Shepherd property, resting on a floodplain, might conceal evidence of prior habitation, or earlier deaths, dating before Elias ever arrived. His survey, though limited by crude instruments, revealed faint depressions beneath the 7 graves, suggesting older burials beneath the newer ones. He noted, "If this is accurate, Mr. Shepherd may have chosen his plots knowingly, atop an older cemetery or what remained of one." The revelation caused quiet panic among locals. Preachers spoke of cursed ground, while farmers blamed the flood for unearthing what should have stayed buried. One newspaper from Knoxville ran a small piece under the headline, "The Hollow of 7 Brides." But within a week, the editor retracted it, citing lack of substantiation. Still, the phrase spread in whispers until no one referred to the place as anything else. As months turned to years, the Shepherd property decayed. His cabin, left unclaimed, collapsed into the soil. Travelers who passed through reported that the air near the grove was colder and that their horses refused to approach the fence. Clara Dunworth, then married and living in town, confessed to her husband that she sometimes dreamed of the man's voice reciting scripture in the night. Always the same verse, "The Lord hath taken away." In 1901, nearly 2 decades after the first discovery, a new constable named Henry Mott attempted to reopen the file. He hoped to identify the women through emerging state census archives and church marriage registers. But the clerk's records from that period were missing, destroyed, ironically, by another flood that same spring. The coincidence was bitter enough to halt further pursuit. Still, one final notation appears in the Claymore County Record Book, written in Mott's hand. Visited the property known as Shepherd's Grove. Ground undisturbed. Fence intact. Heard faint singing beyond the oaks, though no person visible. Returned before dark. No further entry follows. By 1905, the hollows were nearly abandoned. Farms had failed, the soil turned sour, and a slow exodus began toward the rail towns. Those who stayed swore that when fog pooled over the grove, it moved against the wind, curling inward, as though drawn toward the heart of the earth. Whether that was mere imagination or something older, something buried long before Elias Shepherd's time, remains uncertain. By the time the first decade of the new century arrived, Tennessee Hollows had already slipped into a kind of historical twilight. The railroad bypassed it, the post office shuttered, and the last schoolteacher packed her books and left for Cookeville. What remained were mossed stones, a sagging bridge, and the unmarked fence around what locals whispered to be the Shepherd burial ground. In 1910, a young clerk named Walter Emery was assigned to reorganize the county's old records. Most of the files had been moved into a brick annex near the courthouse, their paper browned and curling like tobacco leaves. While sorting the archives, Emery found a small packet tied with string, labeled only Case Shepherd E. Inside were brittle affidavits, sketches of the burial plots, and one weathered journal that did not belong to any officer. Its first page bore the signature T. Rowe M.D. Docker. Rowe's journal began shortly after the death of Elias Shepherd. The entries were terse at first. Observations of soil conditions, notes on forensic methods, a list of tools used in exhumation. But halfway through, the tone shifted from factual to introspective. One entry read, "I dream again of the hollow. The arrangement of the stones appears in my mind unbidden. I wake with the sense that each grave was not placed but called." Emery, fascinated, showed the book to the county magistrate, who instructed him to make a typed copy for preservation. As he transcribed, Emery began to notice small, cryptic symbols penciled in the margins. A series of triangles, intersecting circles, and letters, M, C, R, O, H, repeated in no apparent pattern. He sent a query to the Nashville Historical Society, asking if such markings resembled any known religious or funerary customs. Their reply was polite but uncertain. The symbols, they said, most closely resembled folk talismans of Appalachian origin, associated with protection of burial sites or binding of restless spirits. That reply never reached the public, but Emery's typed copy did. A few paragraphs were later quoted in a local pamphlet about Tennessee folklore, stripped of names but recognizable to anyone who knew the story. From there, the tale began to evolve. Some said Elias Shepherd had been a widower, cursed by his wives' untimely deaths. Others claimed he had made a pact to keep them near. Meanwhile, the oak grove itself was changing. The 7 depressions had softened, filled by years of leaf fall and erosion, but the soil refused grass. Travelers said the area looked scorched, though no fire had ever touched it. A minister who rode through in 1912 described the place as hushed, as if the earth there still listened for something that had ceased speaking. It was around that time that an itinerant photographer, Edwin Capps, visited Claymore while documenting remnants of the 1882 southern United States floods for an anniversary article. Hearing of the Shepherd mystery, he persuaded the sheriff to escort him to the site. The photograph he took, a dim, fog-veiled image showing the remnants of the fence and the 7 faint hollows, was later printed in a small Nashville journal under the caption, "Forgotten Fields of the Floodplain." Capps's photo reignited public curiosity. Letters poured into the county office from distant towns, descendants of missing women, historians seeking forgotten settlements, even self-proclaimed mediums offering interpretation of the soil's memory, but with no surviving witnesses and only fragments of Dr. Rowe's notes. There was little to tell them. Sheriff Mott, still alive but frail, remarked to a reporter, "You can dig up the same ground 100 times, and it'll never give you what it doesn't wish to." In the years that followed, local children dared one another to walk the hollow by moonlight. Some claimed to hear the rustle of skirts among the trees. Others swore they saw figures bending near the oak stump as if tending to invisible graves. One boy who ventured too close returned pale, unable to speak for a week, and later insisted he had heard someone whisper his own name from below the ground. By 1915, county officials decided to relocate remaining settlers from the floodplain, citing unstable terrain. The Shepherd property, abandoned for over 20 years, was declared condemned. Dr. Rowe's journal disappeared from the archive soon after, possibly borrowed, possibly stolen. Only Emery's typewritten copy remained, but it too bore an odd omission. The final 3 pages were blank. When asked years later, Emery said softly they were never blank. They simply stopped showing what was written. No one knew quite what he meant. He resigned the following month and left Tennessee for good. A year later, a heavy storm swept through Claymore County. Not a flood, but enough to tear away the last fragments of fencing around the grove. Afterward, the area was unrecognizable. The 7 depressions had deepened into one shallow basin filled with dark water that never seemed to drain. Locals called it Widow's Pond. Cows refused to graze near it. Birds avoided the trees, and when the wind moved through the hollow, it carried a low, keening hum, as though the soil itself remembered. By the time the First World War ended, all that was left of the Shepherd's story existed in fragments. Rowe's missing journal, the faded photograph, the surviving Bible kept in a private collection, and the oral retellings passed from one frightened generation to the next. In every version, though, one thing remained constant. The number 7, 7 wives, 7 graves, and one secret that the earth never gave back. In the spring of 1918, a Nashville antiquarian named Horace Bellwether placed an advertisement in the Tennessean offering a modest reward for medical journals or county records from the Claymore district. Circa 1880 to 1895, he had come across the name Dr. Thomas Rowe in a private letter belonging to a retired judge, and he believed the missing notebook, the original, not Emery's copy, might still exist in some forgotten trunk or attic. Bellwether's inquiry might have gone unnoticed, had it not been read by Martha Pelham, the widow of the same August Pelham who had once served as Claymore's clerk. She wrote back to Bellwether a week later, claiming she still had certain papers of a sensitive nature that her husband had removed from county storage after the flood of 1901. She invited Bellwether to visit her home in Murfreesboro to discuss them discreetly. He arrived that June, carrying little more than a satchel and his curiosity. Mrs. Pelham led him to an upstairs room where a wooden chest sat beneath a dust cloth. Inside lay several warped folders, a rusted key and a half-burned notebook whose first page bore a faint embossed name T. Rowe. Bellwether's notes, later found among his own effects, describe the moment, pages brittle, corners eaten by mold, but ink visible in sections. Last entries written in haste, hand trembling, uneven. Several words illegible save for one recurring phrase, "The ground remembers." He persuaded Mrs. Pelham to let him copy portions of the text, promising not to publish without her approval. But something in the notebook unsettled him deeply. Within weeks of returning to Nashville, his acquaintances noticed a change. He spoke often of patterns in decay, of how certain deaths seemed to echo one another through place rather than time. He withdrew from his club, stopped eating, and eventually vanished. His boarding room was found empty except for a single envelope addressed to the keeper of the Claymore files. Inside were 2 torn notebook leaves written in Rose's uneven hand. The fragments read, "I fear what I have unearthed is older than the shepherd man. His spade found what he did not understand. There are bones below bones, some bare marks not made by tools. If anyone should find this, beware the oak stump at the circle's heart. Beneath it lies the beginning." And the reason the others followed. The disappearance of Bellwether made a small item in the local paper. Historian missing. Left notes concerning old Claymore mystery. It stirred interest again in the case, prompting one final official visit to Tennessee Hollows. In 1919, a survey team was dispatched to verify the existence of Widow's Pond and document the area for possible reclamation. What they found was unsettling. The pond had receded slightly, leaving a cracked depression in which fragments of wooden fencing jutted like ribs. The central oak stump, mentioned in Dr. Rose's notes, was gone, torn up by some force that left a crater around its roots. At the crater's base lay bits of limestone and what the team leader described as a peculiar metallic residue, greenish, with the smell of iron and something else, something sweet. They sent samples to the State College for examination. The results, preserved in a small appendix of the survey report, state only residue organic, source undetermined. Of course, this was no longer the era for folklore. The new century was about progress, electricity, and reason. Few had patience for tales of haunted ground or cursed men. Yet, even in the age of machines, there are corners of land that resist explanation, where progress feels like an intrusion. The Hollows was one of those corners. By the 1920s, the place had become little more than a name in regional ghost stories, retold by railroad men and field workers around campfires. The Shepherd and His Seven, they called it. Some versions made Elias a murderer, others a grief-mad widower, others still a victim of the flood who lost his wives to the current and buried what the river returned. Each telling changed, yet all ended the same way. The graves remained, and the ground hummed when the wind came from the south. A folklorist from Vanderbilt, Professor Edgar Pike, collected several of these accounts in 1923. In his compiled notes, he observed that nearly all versions of the story contained references to water, running water, standing water, or the sound of it in dreams. Pike speculated that the legend grew from the trauma of the 1882 southern United States floods, which had obliterated boundaries between land and grave. He concluded, perhaps the shepherd myth endures because it speaks to a deeper terror, the fear that the dead are never truly where we left them. Still, Pike could not ignore one detail that troubled him. In all the testimonies, whether from old residents or new settlers, the number of graves reported in the hollow was never 7. Some spoke of 6, others of 8 or 9, as if the land itself could not keep count. His final note in the archive ends with a single, uncertain line. If Rose's warning was true, there was one more beneath the oak. By then, the oak stump was gone, and the hollow, once alive with rumors, had returned to silence. But silence, as the old county men used to say, does not mean peace. It simply means waiting, and in Tennessee Hollows, the ground was very patient. The summer of 1927 was dry enough that even the creeks around Tennessee Hollows thinned to ribbons. Farmers in Claymore County watched cracks open in their fields wide enough to swallow fence posts. It was during that parched spell that a small crew from the Tennessee Geological Survey arrived, led by Professor Edwin F. Macabre, a tall man with round spectacles and an enthusiasm for soil strata. Their purpose was routine. to map mineral deposits left behind by earlier floods, especially the Great Deluge of 1882, which still served as a historical marker for every geological record in the region. Macrae's team set camp near Widow's Pond, unaware or indifferent to the stories that clung to it. They carried measuring rods, not crosses, and spoke of layers, not legends. In his surviving field diary, Macrae wrote, "The terrain here displays unusual subsidence. Topsoil unusually compact for a floodplain, as though tamped repeatedly by heavy weight or human effort." On the second day, one of his assistants struck something solid with a spade. Thinking it a buried fence post, they dug deeper, nearly 3 feet, and uncovered the edge of a carved stone, squared and smooth. They thought it a foundation remnant, but the shape extended downward at a sharp angle. Beneath the first stone lay others, arranged in an arc. Macrae ordered a full excavation, recording each step meticulously. What they uncovered was not a foundation at all, but a ring of 7 flat stones surrounding a hollow center, the faint trace of an 8th slab once placed at the core. The stones bore no visible writing, only tool marks, chisel lines too crude for gravestones yet too deliberate for natural rock. Around them, fragments of charred wood suggested the remains of the fence, or perhaps the vanished oak stump mentioned in Rowe's notes. That night, Macrae noted a curious detail in his journal: the air within the excavation noticeably cooler than surface temperature. Compass needle deflected erratically when placed near the center. No magnetic ore detected nearby. The following morning, he ordered further digging within the circle's core, despite his assistant Mr. Porter urging caution. At approximately 5 feet, the soil gave way to a cavity, an air pocket releasing a faint odor of iron and rot. They enlarged the opening and lowered a lantern inside. What they found below remains one of the more peculiar records in Tennessee's early geological files. The cavity opened into a small, man-made pit lined with stacked stones no more than 5 feet wide. Within it lay a collapsed wooden box, its planks blackened with age. Inside that, according to the report, were organic remnants of uncertain type, commingled with fragments of linen and metallic thread. Macrae described them with scientific detachment, yet his last line faltered. Composition consistent with human remains, possibly juvenile. Further examination to follow. That sentence alone would have changed nothing, until that night. A storm swept through unexpectedly, brief but violent, as if the summer sky had broken open in protest. When the crew returned to the site at dawn, the pit had flooded. Their equipment was scattered, one tent flattened. Most disturbing, the ring of stones had shifted, subtly, but undeniably. Macrae's meticulous sketches no longer matched what lay before him. He recorded in frustration, "We are victims of prank or erosion. The stones now form irregular arrangement, and one appears newly fractured." Yet Porter swore no one had entered the site during the night. They refilled the hole, packed their instruments, and left by noon. Officially, their report concluded that the subsidence posed a safety hazard, recommending no further excavation. But Macrae's private correspondence, preserved later by his niece, told a different story. In a letter dated August 3, 1927, he wrote, "I have seen patterns repeat themselves, in rivers, in rock, in men. The shepherd ground bears a symmetry of intent. I suspect those before us buried not their dead, but their guilt." He never returned to the hollows. By autumn, locals noticed Widow's Pond had returned, larger than before, swallowing the excavation site entirely. The water stood motionless even during windstorms, black as shale. Hunters said animals refused to drink from it. One evening, a farmer named Caleb Nix claimed to see a woman's reflection on the pond's surface, though no one else was there. He described her as standing straight as a post, pale, hair dark and dripping, mouth open as though speaking. His story spread quickly, though most dismissed it as whiskey talk. But 2 weeks later, Nix was found drowned, not in the pond, but in his own rain barrel, his face oddly calm. The coroner ruled it an accident. Still, folks in Claymore whispered that he had looked too long. Professor Macrae published nothing about the shepherd site after that year. He died in 1931, leaving behind one unpublished manuscript simply titled "The Pattern of Earth." In it, he wrote a single, haunting sentence underlined twice. There are places where the soil itself keeps record, not in words, but in recurrence. His niece donated his papers to the state library decades later, where archivists noted faint stains on several pages, like prints of damp fingers. By then, the name Shepherd had faded from official memory. Yet each generation found its way back to the hollow, drawn by rumor, curiosity, or chance, and each time the pattern began anew. In the winter of 1935, a Works Progress Administration crew was sent into the forgotten corners of Tennessee to survey abandoned settlements and catalog landmarks of cultural interest. The hollows, still mapped faintly as Shepherd Valley, appeared on their list almost as an afterthought. The supervisor, Mr. Lionel Crane, brought with him 3 men, a mule cart, and a newly issued camera to document the decaying countryside. Their journal, preserved in the state archive, is plain and workmanlike until the entry of December 17, 1935, when the team reached what was marked as Widow's Pond. It describes a half-frozen basin bordered by ancient oaks, or what remained of them, their bark silvered and peeling like old paper. The men found remnants of the 1927 excavation, shards of crates, rusted chisels, and a signpost half sunk in mud, bearing the faded word DNGR. Crane wrote that the water had a sheen, like oil over coal, reflecting little light despite the clear sky. When they tested its depth with a rod, it sank over 12 feet without touching bottom. The mule refused to approach, braying until released. The men joked nervously that the pond still kept its secrets. Yet what disturbed Crane most was not the water, but the ground surrounding it. The soil trembled faintly, as though hollow beneath, and the frost seemed to pattern itself in circles. He recorded a simple observation, matter of fact yet chilling. The earth here appears to breathe. Later that night, as the men made camp on higher ground, one of them, Reuben Ellis, the youngest, woke the others, swearing he heard a woman humming below the wind. None believed him until Crane noted it too, a faint, tuneless murmur rising from the direction of the pond. It lasted several minutes before fading into the trees. The next morning, their camera jammed twice before producing a single photograph of the site. The image, when developed, showed not just the pond, but faint vertical streaks behind it, as though someone had been moving through the frame. The negatives were sent to Nashville, where technicians blamed light leakage. The men, relieved to leave, packed up before noon. Crane's final note on the matter reads, "I have no interest in folklore, yet I sense that something once buried here has not ceased its shifting. The air tastes of rust. We proceed eastward." The WPA's official report omitted any mention of these details, citing only unstable ground, site not recommended for development. But the rumor of the breathing pond spread quietly through the region, adding another layer to the Shepherd folklore. It was around this time that a retired constable named Henry Mott, the same who had revisited the property decades earlier, decided to write his own recollections for the Claymore Gazette, which still printed weekly for a dwindling readership. His column, Remnants of the Old Valley, ran for 5 issues before being discontinued. In the 3rd installment, Mott revisited his 1901 inspection and described something he'd omitted from the official record. "When I stood by the 7th grave, I counted 6 depressions only. The 7th had vanished as though the earth had drawn it flat overnight. Yet when I stepped upon that spot, I felt it give, soft as bread dough beneath the crust." He ended the column abruptly. If the ground remembers, it also forgets, and chooses which. A week later, Mott fell ill with pneumonia and died before the final article went to print. The editor claimed his remaining notes were lost, though some insisted he had burned them himself. The late 1930s brought another flood season, lighter than 1882, but heavy enough to wash through the lower valleys. When the waters receded, the hollows changed again. Travelers who passed through found Widow's Pond gone, drained, its basin cracked and dry, as though something beneath had finally collapsed. In its place lay a depression nearly 30 yards across, lined with clay the color of ash. A single oak sapling grew from its center. The local preacher, Reverend Carter Bly led a small group to consecrate the area, reading from Psalm 130. Witnesses later said his voice echoed oddly, though there were no surrounding hills to cause it. It came back to us. One woman wrote, as though the ground was reading along. Bly marked the site with a wooden cross, which, according to the caretaker's log, was gone within a month. No sign of theft, simply vanished. By then, the hollows were deserted again. The Depression had driven families north. Only wind and rain remained. But one final visitor came that year, Edwin Capps, the aging photographer who had first captured the grove in 1912. He returned with a new camera and a weary fascination. Locals told him the pond had drained, but he found instead a pale mist hanging low over the basin. His last glass plate photograph, later discovered among his estate, shows that mist curling in distinct spirals, 7 in total, radiating outward like ripples frozen in time. Capps died shortly thereafter, before he could annotate the plate. Yet on its reverse, someone, perhaps him, perhaps another hand, had scrawled 3 words in pencil: "It breathes still." After that, no official expeditions ventured into Tennessee hollows. The roads deteriorated, bridges rotted, and the valley returned to what it had always been: a silence between ridges half remembered in county lore. But silence, as the record has shown, does not mean stillness. It only means waiting for someone to listen again. Among the weather-stained papers salvaged from the Claymore Courthouse fire of 1942, one fragment stood out. It was a partial deposition, handwritten in a faint and wavering script, signed simply Ruth Shepard. Archivists assumed it belonged to a daughter or niece of the original family, though no formal birth record for such a woman has ever surfaced. The fragment's ink had bled almost to illegibility, but the first lines were still clear enough to read, "If you read this, the truth will not rest with me. The ground knows its names. I only tend what remains." The deposition was undated but appears to reference the same terrain once called the Shepherd Farmstead. Ruth describes living alone on the high ridge, tending graves that sink too fast. She recounts hearing the soil shift like sighs beneath her cabin floor and feeling the cool breath of the hollow through the boards at night. Though some historians dismiss the document as local superstition written decades after the events, others point to the handwriting, delicate but deliberate, as typical of women educated in the 1860s, not the 20th century. One paleographer noted that the letter forms of F and S were Hoffa-style pre-dating the Civil War, suggesting the author might have been writing long before the hollow was abandoned. If Ruth's account is genuine, it would mean that one member of the Shepherd line survived far longer than the 7 graves implied. The deposition continues. He said the earth was kind, that it would take what was given and leave the rest untouched. But he lied. It never stopped taking. The pond came later, and with it the song. I hear her still when the frost comes early. Here, presumably refers to Abner Shepherd, the patriarch around whom all prior testimony revolved. Yet what song Ruth heard remains unexplained. Folklorists examining the piece in the 1950s compared it to regional laments from the 19th century, particularly the mournful work chants used by flood survivors during the 1882 Tennessee deluge, which had erased entire settlements and left fields slick with gray clay. That calamity, mentioned in so many of the surrounding accounts, seems woven into the Shepherd story like a watermark. Ruth's words hint at that disaster not as an isolated event, but as part of a pattern, the land reclaiming what humans built atop it. The fragment ends with a line more prayer than confession. May the 7th stay closed. The archivist who first catalogued the document, Miss Ellen Brandt, reportedly refused to handle it again after transcribing it. In her field notes, she wrote that the paper smelled faintly of wet soil despite being dry, and that the lower edge seemed darkened as if by water, though no other documents in the same drawer were affected. When asked to explain, she said only, "It wasn't damp, it was breathing." Her colleagues laughed it off, but Brandt resigned the following year. She died in 1944, and her personal diaries, preserved by her niece, show that she had recurring dreams of a woman in the clay, singing without mouth or sound. No additional records of Ruth Shepard were found until 1951, when a land survey uncovered the foundation of a small cabin on the ridge above the old pond site. Beneath one of the floor beams, workers discovered a rusted box containing a silver locket, a small comb, and a bundle of folded parchment too brittle to open. Photographs taken at the time show faint writing on the outermost page, the same looping hand as the courthouse fragment. Within weeks, the box and its contents were sent to the State University for preservation. They never arrived. A freight manifest shows that the parcel left Claymore Station aboard a southbound train on March 19, 1951, but no record of delivery exists. The only surviving clue comes from a maintenance worker who later testified that the crate split at a junction outside Cookeville, and that the papers blew like white birds into the dark. The state archivist, when asked to confirm, replied dryly, "We have enough ghosts in our records already." Yet one photograph survives, a blurry image of the locket before it vanished. Inside it, under the cracked glass, appears a miniature portrait of a man's face, narrow and severe, with what seems to be a small brand, like mark beneath one eye. Comparing the photograph to the 1879 daguerreotype of Abner Shepard taken by itinerant photographer H.D. Prawl, the resemblance is unmistakable. If Ruth truly lived to write her account, then she not only outlasted her kin, she kept watch over their resting place, perhaps even guarding it. Her final plea, "May the seventh stay closed," implies she knew what had been unearthed or risked being unearthed again. In later years, the ridge where her cabin once stood was overgrown with sumac and pine. Locals said no bird nested there, and even deer skirted its edge. One farmer told a regional journalist in 1963, "When you walk there, you don't hear your own footsteps, just the wind filling in behind you." Today, that ridge is unmarked on any official map, lost between property boundaries and reservoir expansions. But among the surviving folklore collections, one rural hymn recorded near the site includes a refrain that feels almost too close to Ruth's words to be coincidence. "Seven lie where the water ran, one waits till the frost returns again." Whether she lived or not, Ruth Shepard's voice, or what people believed to be hers, carried far beyond the hollow she tended. By the 1960s, Tennessee's smaller county offices had begun the process of consolidating their archives. Thousands of pages, property ledgers, court depositions, coroner's notes, were transferred to the State Historical Office in Nashville. Among the crates labeled C.A. Weimar 1880-1910, clerks found a bundle of mismatched files that would later be cataloged under a single, unofficial name, the Hollow Files. Most of the papers were damp, edges fused by mildew. But inside were fragments of correspondence between the Claymore Sheriff's Office and state investigators spanning nearly 20 years. The earliest dated to 1884, a year after the Shepard family disappeared, while the latest, written in 1903, was a terse note from a Nashville inspector named Jeremiah Lotz. "No further inquiry. Recommend sealing of property deeds and discontinuance of name in public rolls." The decision to erase the Shepard tract from official maps was confirmed later that same year. On the revised chart of 19, the parcel simply became unclaimed wetland. Yet one letter among the bundle stands out, a personal message from Constable Henry Mott to a regional coroner. Dated March 10, 1886, it reads in spidery ink, "I've returned from the hollows again. There are new sinkings along the ridge, and what looks like a handprint in the clay wall near the pond's north bank. Not fresh, not old. Just there." The coroner's reply, though half-eaten by time, is legible enough. "You mistake root patterns for shapes, Henry. Clay remembers everything if you stare long enough." That phrase, "Clay remembers everything," became something of a motto among researchers decades later. It appeared again in the margins of a 1935 WPA field log, and later still in the notes of Dr. Miriam Kale, a folklorist at Vanderbilt who spent most of the 1970s studying the cultural silence of the hollows. Dr. Kale believed the Shepard case served as a rural echo of trauma left by the 1882 southern United States floods. which had scarred the lowlands of Tennessee and buried hundreds of unidentified victims beneath new riverbeds. "The soil is our only surviving witness," she wrote in 1976, and it often speaks through myth. In interviews, elderly residents recalled fragments of the shepherd legend but disagreed on its timeline. Some claimed Abner was a Civil War deserter who changed his name. Others said the wives weren't his but boarders who vanished one by one after storms. One particularly old man, Silas Quinn, who remembered the WPA surveyors, told Cale, "They kept saying there were 7 graves, but we always said 8. The last was for the land itself." Cale included the quote in her 1978 paper, Geography of Mourning, Folklore and Reclaimed Earth in the Upper Cumberland, which earned little attention at the time. Only a handful of copies survive, but the paper drew an unexpected letter from a reader in Kentucky who claimed to possess one of the Shepherd journals. When Cale visited the address in 1979, she found the house empty, windows boarded, mail uncollected. The neighbor said the occupant, a reclusive man named Elias Drew, had died the previous winter and was buried without kin. Among his possessions, county records note a trunk of papers destroyed for dampness. Whether those were the same journals is uncertain. Still, the story persisted, growing quieter yet sharper, like a note held too long. In 1981, the Nashville Evening Ledger ran a retrospective titled 7 Graves, 7 Wives, Revisiting Tennessee's Lost Hollow. The article reprinted some of Mott's letters and featured an interview with Dr. Cale, who by then had stopped her fieldwork entirely. She told the reporter, "There's something about that place I can't reconcile. Every map I've used shifts when I overlay the coordinates. The pond, the graves, the ridge, they never stay where they should be." She later clarified in her journal that she wasn't speaking metaphorically. The coordinates literally didn't align, even when adjusted for scale. The discrepancies were small, yards, sometimes feet, but enough that the valley's geography refused to match any modern survey. When Cale revisited the area in 1983, guided by an old topographic map, she found the remains of a fence post with iron nails eaten to red dust. Beyond it stretched an open field she didn't recognize. "The ground was too soft to walk," she wrote. "It felt as though something underneath had been recently disturbed." Her assistant, Paul Dent, photographed the area and recorded a faint rhythmic sound. When he played the tape back later, 7 pulses, low and hollow, almost imperceptible. He assumed it was a machine in the distance. Cale disagreed. She wrote only, "The valley still breathes." That phrase, echoing through a century of notes, from Mott's Breathing Earth to the WPA men's Trembling Pond, seems to be the one constant. Each generation that entered the hollows came away describing motion where there should be none. The final entry in the hollow files is unsigned, likely from the early 1900s. It reads simply, "Would have counted wrong." No further explanation follows. After the files were cataloged, they were sealed in acid-free boxes and stored under restricted access at the state archives. Requests to view them, according to internal memos, have been politely discouraged. When one graduate student petitioned for access in 1998, he was told the papers were undergoing conservation treatment. They never reappeared in the catalog. Even now, local librarians refer to that omission in hushed tones. One said, "It's not the files they're preserving, it's the silence between them." In the spring of 1992, a man named Harold Kemp appeared in Claymore with a rented backhoe and a single-minded plan. He'd been working as an amateur historian, publishing small pamphlets on forgotten Southern families, and claimed he'd discovered proof that the Shepherd estate lay atop a sealed burial vault of regional importance. The townspeople didn't take him seriously. Many had never heard of the Shepherd name. Kemp was methodical. He set up camp near what locals called the Old Bend Road, the closest navigable path to the hollows, and began interviewing anyone who'd lived nearby before the war. A few elders remembered the valley's reputation, its breathing pond, the widow's hymn, but most shrugged him off. Still, Kemp pressed on. He had with him copies of the hollow files. How he obtained them remains unclear. Maps annotated in red pencil, and an old topographic chart from 1904 showing faint dotted lines where wetland depressions once lay. He was last seen heading into the valley on April 7, 1992, driving the rented machine and towing a small generator. 3 days later, the rental company reported the equipment overdue. Sheriff's deputies found it parked at the edge of the ridge, engine off, keys missing. Kemp's tent stood nearby, coffee cup half full, radio still hissing static. The clay around the site was disturbed, as though something heavy had been moved or dragged, but there were no footprints leading away. The search party combed the area for 2 days, finding only a single glove and a notebook sealed in a plastic bag. Inside were 6 pages of notes and a small hand-drawn map marked with 7X arranged in a crescent. On the final page, Kemp had written, "Ground soft, hollow beneath layers. Hearing low resonance, almost rhythmic. Do not continue without rope or light. The 7th site." The sentence stops there, the ink smeared. After the investigation was closed, the sheriff filed a brief report. Subject likely lost footing in unstable ground. No remains recovered due to risk of subsidence. Officially, Kemp was listed as missing, presumed dead. But some years later, his sister Elaine gave an interview to the Cookeville Chronicle. She said that weeks before the trip, Harold had been sending her letters describing dreams of a woman counting from 1 to 7, and earth that swallows sound. The last letter arrived the morning after he disappeared. It contained only one line: "I've found the song Ruth wrote about." That same year, a severe storm passed through Tennessee, flooding several of the state's smaller reservoirs. Among the sites affected was the area once known as Tennessee Hollows. Satellite photos from 1993 show a new, circular body of water in the valley's center, nearly identical in shape and size to the long, vanished Widow's Pond. The resemblance was so striking that a few local papers mentioned it briefly under human interest columns, calling it a ghost lake returning after a century. But to those who'd studied the shepherd legend, the coincidence was too precise to ignore. Dr. Miriam Kale, then in her late 60s, came out of retirement to comment. In a 1994 radio interview, she said, "If the earth has reopened, then something beneath it has not finished its story. Folklore isn't repetition, it's continuation." Listeners later recalled that her voice trembled slightly when she spoke the words "has reopened." In the following months, the newly formed lake, locals began calling it Kemp's Basin, developed an odd reputation. Fishermen reported equipment sinking unexpectedly in shallow water. A park ranger noted in his log that the surface would pulse in patterns on still mornings, though no wind was present. In October, a diver from a nearby college attempted to explore the basin for geological samples. He descended only once. His written statement afterward reads, "Visibility near zero. Bottom feels uneven, as though layered with cloth. Heard mechanical vibration. Counted 7 intervals. Surface immediately." He refused to go back down. 2 weeks later, his research partner measured irregular magnetic readings around the pond's edge. Short bursts spaced evenly apart. The equipment was tested elsewhere and found to function normally. By 1996, the site was quietly fenced off, citing soil instability. No further excavations were authorized. The area reverted again to private land, purchased under an LLC that listed no contact name, only the address of a Nashville law office. In 1998, a former state archivist, one of the few who had handled the original Shepherd documents, visited Kemp's sister. She later told reporters he'd seemed distraught, repeating the phrase, "They never stayed buried." None of them did. He left behind a sealed envelope addressed to the Historical Society. Inside was a single photograph, dated and stamped April 6, 1992, 1 day before Kemp vanished. It showed the dig site from a distance, the backhoe poised above the ridge. In the lower corner, a shadow can be seen stretching from the pit, elongated beyond proportion. At first glance, it seems like a trick of light, but when enlarged, the shadow splits at the end, like fingers pressed against the ground from beneath. That photograph remains in the Society's restricted collection. Scholars who've seen it in person note that the image, after all these decades, still carries a faint scent of damp clay. And so the Shepherd Hollow continued to resist closure. Every generation that tried to explain it found itself instead absorbed by rumor, by earth, by silence. In 2003, an anonymous envelope arrived at the Tennessee State Historical Office. The return address was blank, but the postmark read Cookeville. Inside were 12 typed pages titled Statement of Custodian H.L. Rhett, concerning the Shepherd case. The author's identity was easy to guess, Harold L. Benton, who had served as assistant archivist from 1968 to 1985, then retired early after suffering what colleagues called nervous exhaustion. His statement was not an academic paper but a confession, part diary, part apology. It began calmly enough. My duty was preservation. I failed in that. What we kept, the ground took back. What we sealed, it unsealed. Benton described being assigned to rebox and label a portion of the hollow files in 1974 after staff complaints about the smell of damp soil from the storage room. The papers had not been opened since the 1930s. His first entry detailed how the cardboard crumbled at his touch, leaving a residue like fine silt. He wore gloves, yet the grit worked under the nails like dust alive. There was no leak in the room, no water damage visible, yet the pages sweated moisture each morning, then dried again by night. Benton wrote that over the next months he began to hear a faint rhythmic rustle, 7 beats in a cycle, whenever he handled the files. At first he assumed it was paper shifting in its box. But when he counted aloud to test it, the sound paused, then resumed as if in response. He requested the boxes be moved to a new location. Permission was granted. But during transport, one crate split open, scattering its contents. A janitor assisting him reported a soft whispering noise from inside the fallen stack. Benton recalled that the janitor, pale and trembling, refused to continue, saying, "It's the ground again." That phrase, the same one uttered by Henry Mott decades earlier, appeared multiple times in Benton's account. He noted that he later began tracing soil samples found at the bottom of each box. The composition, tested by a university lab, contained an unusually high concentration of clay and trace elements consistent with flood sediment from the 1882 southern United States floods. But how? Benton wrote, does flood clay from 1882 appear inside sealed archival boxes moved thrice and kept on dry floors for half a century? When Benton presented his findings to the department head, he was told to cease inquiries beyond your assignment. Soon after, the hollow files were marked for restricted access. Benton signed the order himself, though he noted in his statement, it was not to protect the documents from people. It was to protect the people from the documents. The narrative then shifted from bureaucratic notes to something more personal. Benton began to experience vivid dreams. He described standing beside a still pond under a pale and constant twilight. In the dream, he saw 7 shapes beneath the surface, shifting slowly as if turning in their sleep. On waking, his sheets were damp with the scent of clay. He started keeping a small recorder by his bed. When he played back the tapes, he sometimes heard a hum he could not account for. It matches, he wrote, the frequency of the building's air vent when running, but the vent was off. By 1981, Benton was convinced that the Shepherd documents themselves were an extension of whatever haunted the land. The stories, the letters, the photographs, he said they changed weight slightly from week to week, as if absorbing humidity or something unseen. He began weighing them daily and claimed the combined mass fluctuated by a few grams. His notes show careful precision, yet no pattern. He also claimed that one afternoon, when he opened the box labeled Routes, a piece of paper fell free that no one had catalogued before. It bore no signature, only 3 lines in faded script. Do not open the 7th. Do not sing where the water lies. The ground counts when we do not. Benton sealed that page separately and hid it within the building's lower stacks, inside an unrelated file. In his confession, he admitted doing this, out of fear that it was not yet finished writing. He concluded, I have spent my life keeping words from decay, yet these words decay me. The shepherds, the wives, the hollow, they were never lost. They only changed their form. I believe the paper itself is their new soil. I will not open the boxes again. The pages of Benton's confession end abruptly after that line. But taped to the last sheet was a small square of photographic paper, blank except for a faint imprint of what looks like the edge of a fingerprint pressed in clay. The historical office logged the envelope, but never made its contents public. When a journalist requested it, under the state's Open Records Act, the reply read, "Document unavailable due to biological contamination." A decade later, in 2013, the archivist who processed that request told a graduate student, the contamination wasn't biological, it was chronological. When pressed, she refused to explain. If Benton's account is true, and many who read it believe parts of it were, the Shepherd Hollow's secret may never have been entirely buried. It simply migrated, one medium to another, earth to record to memory. And as every historian learns, memory never stops breathing. In 2015, a graduate student named Nadia Rowe from Vanderbilt University stumbled across an uncatalogued box in the restricted media room of the Tennessee Historical Office. It was small, mislabeled as Rural Oral Histories, 1970s, and inside she found a single reel-to-reel audio tape with a handwritten tag, Claymore Valley, M. Cale, Field Sample 3B. It appeared to be one of the missing recordings from Dr. Miriam Cale's 1983 return to the Hollows, the same trip during which she'd written, "The Valley Still Breathes." Rowe, unaware of the local legends, threaded the reel onto a restored machine and began digitizing it. For the first 6 minutes, the tape carried only ambient noise, the hiss of wind, faint rustling, and what sounded like insects. Then Cale's voice entered, steady and clear despite the year's 14th. Elevation approximately 720 feet. The ground remains spongy. No visible water source. The surface resonates faintly under footfall, as if hollowed. Rowe noted the academic tone, precise and detached, but at minute 9 Cale's composure wavered. There was a pause, followed by a soft intake of breath. There are indentations here. 7. Each about 4 feet apart, forming a crescent toward the ridge. A faint hum became audible beneath her words. Rhythmic, low, and oddly measured. Cale counted softly, 1, 2, 3, until the hum matched her tempo. Then she stopped speaking altogether. The hum continued, 7 pulses, silence, 7 more. Then, a sound like slow movement through water. Rowe stopped the reel, assuming mechanical feedback. But on playback through modern equipment, the pattern was identical. A layered resonance just below human vocal range, too structured to be random. Further in the tape, Cale whispered again, something under the soil, like air pushing through. "I'm marking this as acoustic disturbance. Paul, can you?" The recording cut abruptly to static. Then, without transition, a woman's voice, softer, older, began to hum a tune. Not words, just a rise and fall, like a lullaby played backward. The meter was slow, repeating 7 notes before trailing off. Rowe replayed it dozens of times. She later wrote in her research journal, not Cale, "The timbre is different, grainier, like someone singing from inside a room with thick walls." She compared the sequence to 19th century Appalachian hymns, but none matched. The melody didn't follow Western scales, it drifted in half, tones that gave the illusion of echo. On a spectrogram, Rowe noticed something even stranger. Faint spikes between the pulses, arranged in a pattern resembling handwriting. When enhanced, the image appeared to trace the letters R.S., Ruth Shepherd. When Rowe shared her findings with her faculty advisor, he dismissed it as pareidolia through spectral analysis. But the anomalies deepened. Each time she replayed the digital file, the background hiss changed slightly, as though the tape itself was rewriting its noise floor. In later playbacks, faint words emerged beneath the hum. "Stay closed." After several days, the file corrupted entirely. The audio waveform flattened, the sound replaced by digital silence. Yet Rowe's recording equipment showed the file size had grown by several megabytes. A technical impossibility without new data being added. That week, Rowe began reporting headaches and an intermittent vibration in her ears, like a pulse beneath the floor. She visited a campus doctor, who diagnosed mild tinnitus and prescribed rest, but she continued to hear the rhythm even away from the lab. 7 beats, pause, 7 more. In October of that year, she presented her findings at a graduate symposium under the cautious title, Phonographic Anomalies in Unindexed Archival Media. During her talk, a section of the playback unexpectedly triggered through the hall's speakers a 7-note hum followed by Cale's voice whispering. Mark this as disturbance. The sound system malfunctioned immediately afterward, producing a deep static that filled the auditorium. Several attendees described feeling pressure in the chest during the noise. The recording devices capturing the event all failed simultaneously. Rowe's department chair confiscated the reel for review, but when technicians attempted to replay it, the tape had fused solid. Its magnetic surface melted into a glossy band, as if exposed to heat. Yet the storage vault where it was kept never rose above 68 degrees. Rowe withdrew from her program the following semester. Her final email to the department included only a single attachment, a short MP3 labeled 7 Lillaby, MP3. The file contained 7 seconds of silence. The timestamp metadata, however, recorded its runtime as 7 minutes and 7 seconds. Later that year, a janitor cleaning the media room found an empty spool of tape under Rowe's desk. Scratched faintly into its metal rim were 3 words, "It breathes still." When asked about the inscription, Rowe, who by then had relocated to another state, claimed she had never owned that reel. The story spread quietly among archivists and audio technicians who began calling the recording the Cale tape. Few who heard it firsthand still have copies. Some describe a lullaby that changes each time it plays, others, nothing at all. And somewhere in the archives, beneath sealed floors and temperature control, the original box labeled Rural Oral Histories, 1970s, remains unaccounted for. The tracking log simply ends with the word misfiled. But the tape, as Rowe later told one confidant before vanishing from academia entirely, didn't stop when it stopped playing. By the spring of 1886, 3 years after the first graves were uncovered in Tennessee hollows, surveyors from the Chickamauga Land Office returned to the valley with orders to map and reclaim the farmland for public sale. One of them, Deputy Surveyor Alphonse Weller, kept meticulous notes, some of which still survive in microfilm. His entries read less like legal records and more like a diary written against his better judgment. On April 3rd, Weller wrote, "The terrain appears warped, as if the very shape of the earth remembers something it cannot quite forget. The Shepherd property is mostly reclaimed by undergrowth, yet the main dwelling remains in partial standing condition. The cellar is exposed by subsidence along the western ridge." Weller and his team began excavation to stabilize the ground. Beneath a layer of collapsed brick and timber, they discovered a second foundation, deeper and older than the visible structure. Constructed of unmortared stone, predating recorded settlement in that part of Claymore Valley. Its alignment didn't match the geometry of the house above it. Instead, it formed a near-perfect septagon. Inside that lower chamber, they found 7 wooden stools arranged in a circle, each marked with a faint engraving: Ruth, Eliza, Marion, Clara, June, Martha, Hannah. The names of all 7 shepherd wives. But beside each stool lay something stranger still, a shallow depression filled with a fine gray powder. Weller's journal described it as the consistency of sifted ash, but without any residue on the skin. He ordered samples taken for chemical analysis, but the vials later shattered during transport, each one cracking along the same vertical seam. No material evidence remains. The discovery, though never published in official ledgers, spread among nearby parishes and county clerks. The Reverend Samuel Cray of Pine Hollow wrote, in a sermon later that year, "There are structures older than any man's sin and deeper than any prayer. What is buried beneath us does not always consent to remain silent." In 1887, after reports of structural collapse, the state declared the Shepherd property unstable and uninhabitable. But Weller, against orders, returned with 2 laborers to finish his survey. That was the last recorded entry under his name. His horse was found grazing near the creek 3 days later, reins still tied. When a new team investigated, they discovered the cellar entrance sealed, not with earth or debris, but with freshly poured limestone. No quarry within 40 miles reported supplying the material. A later affidavit by County Clerk James Keaton referenced own recorded expenditures from the Emergency Relief Fund, justified under the previous year's flood remediation. This aligns with documentation from the 1882 southern United States floods, which devastated Tennessee's backcountry infrastructure and created loopholes in procurement tracking. In other words, someone may have used the disaster's accounting chaos to conceal the costs of sealing that chamber. Keaton's testimony, however, was delivered years later, and he admitted that most of the records had been lost to mold and mouse teeth. His handwriting trembled as he signed the final page. By 1891, the site had become a local taboo. Travelers along the Ridge Road claimed to see smoke at dusk where the farmhouse once stood. Some said it came from the limestone venting, others swore it was chimney ash that rose without a fire. One letter from a woman named Agnes Bright, addressed to her sister in Franklin County, described a night she spent camped near the hollows. Around midnight, there came a sound below my bedroll, a shifting like a door being lifted by the wind. When I struck my lantern, the earth at my feet had sunk a few inches. The air smelled of iron and old rain. I could hear something tapping from below, slow and even, as if counting. Agnes moved her camp before dawn and never returned. The following winter brought another flood. Riverbanks collapsed, and most remaining structures in the valley were swept away. The Shepherd Cellar, according to geological surveys decades later, likely lies buried beneath 12 feet of silt and sediment. Yet the subsidence pattern recorded by aerial mapping in the 20th century shows a recurring 7-point sink, reappearing after each heavy rain. Modern geologists attribute the shape to karst formation, where limestone dissolves unevenly underground. But among locals, the explanation has never sat well. They claim the ground exhales when the weather turns. In 1929, during a Works Progress Administration survey, engineers drilling for soil density near the hollows reported a hollow space roughly 30 feet below surface, consistent with the size of Weller's unregistered chamber. When their drill broke through, they heard what one worker described as a low resonance, like wind in a barrel. Another swore he heard singing. The supervisor dismissed it as air pressure equalizing, filled the borehole with gravel, and moved on. The incident was logged but not followed up. That record, filed under Acoustic Anomalies, Claymore District, was rediscovered in the 1950s by a visiting historian who simply annotated the margin with one note, likely remnants of the Shepherd Foundation. If there is indeed a house beneath the house, it remains sealed. And yet, on some evenings when the valley fog rises thick as milk, hikers have reported faint lights moving just below the ground, as though lanterns carried through glassy soil. The locals say those are the wives, waiting. The more practical among them insist it's methane ignition, a natural phenomenon after rain. Either way, the Hollows does not sleep quietly. When the Shepherd property finally vanished from maps in the early 1890s, most believed the matter concluded. The graves, the cellar, the vanished men, all absorbed by time and bureaucracy. Yet in 1895 a peculiar artifact surfaced in Nashville. Nearly 200 miles from Claymore Valley, a weathered ledger bound in calfskin, its spine unmarked, its pages brittle with age. It appeared first in the possession of an estate auctioneer, Thomas Lyle, who claimed it came from the estate of a deceased rural constable of unrecorded district origin. Inside, the handwriting shifted between several distinct hands, mostly male, rough and hurried, interspersed with what looked like fragments of hymns or poetry. On the inside cover, in red ink that had rusted brown, someone had written, "The account of the seven." Lyle, finding no signature, showed it to a clerk at the Nashville Historical Society, who immediately recognized one of the entries, a record dated March 1884, referencing the Shepherd homestead at Claymore Hollow, Hamilton County. The entry read simply, "Al's seven accounted for. He says they will not trouble the living if the house remains closed. Payment rendered in silence. No name, no recipient, only a faint drawing of an open hand." Further pages contained what seemed like purchase lists, quantities of lime rope and glass oil lamps, all in sevens. Each line ended with a checkmark that looked like a crooked cross. Some pages were torn, others had been glued together with wax. When archivists attempted to separate them, the wax flaked away, releasing a faint, metallic scent, like iron left too long in the rain. A curious addendum appeared toward the ledger's middle. Do not speak their names at sundown. It stirs the hollow air. And in another later note, dated 1887, scrawled in a different hand, Moose sealed it again after the floods. The sound beneath is softer now. The ledger remained uncatalogued for years, quietly moving between private collections until it was purchased by the McKinley County Library in 1912 under its Rare Acquisitions Fund. There it sat in storage until 1941, when historian Dr. W. M. Corliss examined it for his study on post-Reconstruction folklore. Corliss wrote in his field journal, "Off the Shepherd affair, one artifact remains credible, a book of payments and silences. I am convinced at least 2 county officials were complicit in the burial or reburying of something other than bodies." He made a chilling observation. The handwriting of the 1887 entry matched the signature of James Keaton, the same clerk who'd sworn in affidavits about emergency expenditures following the 1882 floods. This linked the ledger directly to county offices and to the quiet funding that had sealed the Shepherd cellar. Corliss attempted to publish his findings in a local journal, but was advised by the state archivist to cease pursuit of matters still under restricted review. The ledger was returned to storage, where it mysteriously disappeared during wartime transfers. Only 2 photographic plates survive, both showing the same page, the one bearing the open hand symbol. That symbol, when later compared by folklorists, resembled a protective sigil used by certain Appalachian revival sects in the late 19th century, groups that mixed scripture with pre-Christian rites of binding and quieting. Such sects often marked burial sites to contain unrestful ground. No sect by that name was ever formally registered in Tennessee, but oral accounts from that era speak of the Quiet Order, an itinerant band of preachers who traveled through flood-stricken communities between 1882 and 1885, offering blessings over damaged farms and promising respite from the noise below. It was never clear what that noise was. A letter found decades later among Corliss's personal papers described a brief correspondence he'd had with an elderly woman from Marion County who claimed to have attended one of those gatherings as a girl. Her recollection: they came after the rain, 7 of them, dressed plain but carrying staffs wrapped in white cloth. They said the water had uncovered what should not breathe air. My father made us stay inside as they sang around the well. When Corliss asked if she remembered their names, she wrote only, no names. Only that they answered to the sound of a bell. The letter was unsigned. By the 1950s, folklorists visiting the hollows noted that locals still avoided speaking the name Shepherd aloud after dark. Children were told that counting to 7 in the valley could wake the soil. Campers reported faint, rhythmic tapping through the ground at night, steady, patient, like someone knocking from below. The Ledger of Silence, as it came to be called by archivists, has since achieved near mythic status. No one knows its current location. One theory claims it was quietly purchased by a private collector in the 1970s who specialized in Civil War artifacts. Another insists it was destroyed in the Nashville Library fire of 1985. Yet copies of one page, the page with the open hand, continue to circulate in small historical circles, often attached to academic papers on Tennessee folklore. Beneath the sketch of the hand, written so faintly it almost disappears in photographs, are the words, "The quiet is the depth." Some scholars have taken this as a poetic metaphor for grief or for the silencing of women in frontier communities. But those who visited Claymore Valley, even in recent years, note something else. When you stand where the farmhouse once stood, the air seems to move differently. It doesn't blow, it pulses, 7 seconds apart. By 1901, Claymore Valley had disappeared from nearly every new atlas printed in Tennessee. The omission was blamed on a cartographic consolidation after county realignments, but several surviving drafts from the State Geological Survey tell a stranger story. On those drafts the valley was drawn, then scratched out. The surveyor responsible, Edward T. Mannion, left a single annotation in his field copy: "Ridge too deep for measure." Repeats. Mannion was a precise man, a veteran of the Army Corps of Engineers who prided himself on triangulation and accuracy. His diaries, preserved by his descendants, describe weeks spent mapping erosion paths near the Chickamauga Basin. "Claymore Valley," he wrote, "does not remain still long enough to measure." He recorded a curious pattern while using his plane table and alidade. The readings he took at 7 evenly spaced stations around the ridge formed a closed loop that should have aligned perfectly. Instead, his angles added up to 362 degrees. 2 degrees too many, an error impossible by the instrument standard. Mannion recalibrated and tried again. The result was the same, always 362 degrees. Always the same error. He began to suspect magnetic interference, possibly from buried iron. Yet, when he checked his compass, it swung erratically near the old Shepherd property, spinning once before settling due north again. Mannion noted that each time the compass spun, the air temperature dropped by several degrees. He later described the sensation as "the valley breathing against the back of my neck." When he reported this anomaly to the district engineer, he was instructed to exclude Claymore from public drafts until soil conditions stabilize. But privately, Mannion continued his investigation. His journals reveal that he sought out locals for oral accounts. One of them, an aging woman identified only as Mrs. Cray, told him she'd lost her uncle to the house below. Mannion's notes paraphrased her story. 7 took him under. Said he should not have drawn their circle. They don't like being measured. Another entry dated October 9, 1901, reads, "Return to ridge before dawn. Low mist rising from soil fissures. At intervals I hear hollow resonance, like distant thunder, but even. 7 pulses, pause, 7 more. The same count I found on Cale's acoustic field records years later. Could it be the same sound?" His mention of Dr. Miriam Cale is anachronistic. She wouldn't conduct her research until 1983. But archivists later suggested that Mannion might have meant another Cale, perhaps her ancestor. The name appeared occasionally in Tennessee census records. Whatever he heard that night changed him. 2 weeks later, his employer received a formal resignation letter written entirely in black ink except for one line, underlined in red penciled. "If the land will not be mapped, it should not be disturbed." Mannion moved west, disappearing into census obscurity. But his abandoned notes remained with the survey office until 1916, when the Geological Survey attempted to reconstruct the missing area. Using Mannion's base coordinates, they discovered that his angular error of 2 degrees actually corresponded to a displacement of about 137 feet. A measurable shift of the valley's magnetic north compared to surrounding terrain. That shift, repeated precisely in later geophysical readings during the 1950s, remains unexplained. It's as though a small portion of the valley rotates infinitesimally slower than the rest of the Earth around it. When news of the anomaly reached local newspapers, journalists dismissed it as a mathematical curiosity. Yet one reporter from the Knoxville Journal, Marjorie Dent, visited the site in 1956 to write a human interest piece titled, "The Valley That Won't Sit Still." Her account was never published in print, but a carbon copy survived in her family papers. She described descending into the old flood plain where the soil was dark as coffee grounds, soft enough to swallow a boot heel. The ruins of the Shepherd house had vanished beneath vines, but she claimed the land still bore faint depressions, shaped like rooms that had melted. Dent took several photographs, all of which later overexposed except one, a crooked shot of the ridge at dusk. In that single surviving image, a pale light appears near the lower left, almost human in outline. Photographic experts later attributed it to lens flare. Dent, however, wrote in her notes, "There was no light that evening. Only the sound of wind coming from under the ground, like air passing through a mouth that shouldn't exist." Within a week of her visit, Dent reportedly resigned from her post and moved to Louisiana. She gave no reason. Over time, the missing valley became something between a joke and a curse among Tennessee mapmakers. Trainees were told, If your compass spins, you've found Claymore. But the state survey maps still omit that region. To this day, the official coordinates leap clean over the old shepherd land, connecting two ridges that on paper should never meet. It's as if, on the map of Tennessee, a small piece of earth simply declined to exist. In 1937, decades after the Shepherd property vanished from county records, a traveling photographer named Horace D. Leach passed through southeastern Tennessee on assignment for the Federal Writers Project. His task was simple: to document forgotten rural communities for a Depression-era exhibition in Washington. The project was meant to celebrate endurance. It instead led Leach into something that would never be displayed. Leach was a quiet man, known for his habit of labeling every negative with obsessive precision. He kept a logbook as thorough as any surveyor's. Entry Fair 2177 reads, "Arrived Claymore region. Locals call it the Hollows. Sparse population. Fog thick before dawn. Air unusually heavy." He had followed the old ridge road south from Soddy, Daisy, guided by a farmer who warned him not to stay past sundown. The man refused to approach closer than the tree line. When Leach asked why, the farmer only said, "Things under there remember water." Leach camped near what maps still labeled Claymore Creek, though the stream had long dried to a trickle. At sunrise, he began taking panoramic shots of the basin. The terrain looked unremarkable: grasses, scattered sycamores, the faint trace of a collapsed homestead mound. But when he developed the negatives later that month in Knoxville, he noticed something impossible. On 3 consecutive frames, the same figure appeared, standing among the reeds. The figure was indistinct, blurred at the edges like a double exposure, yet its placement shifted slightly each frame, as if moving closer. Its outline suggested a woman in a long dress, facing the camera. Leach compared the exposure times. Each shot was taken 20 seconds apart. No one else had been in the valley. He annotated the strip: female form, distance 40 yards. Not visible to eye. Unsettled, he returned to the site 2 weeks later, bringing a colleague, WPA interviewer Samuel Barris, who carried an early portable recorder. They hoped to capture oral histories from any remaining settlers. But they found no occupied homes. Instead, scattered stone piles marked the landscape, some arranged in lines of 7. Barris noted in his transcript, "Soil sounds hollow when struck with cane. HDL claims faint echo like wood below." That night, the two men camped by the creek bed. Around 2 m, Barris switched on his recorder to capture what he described as unsect chorus and nocturnal wind. The wax cylinder ran for just under 5 minutes. Halfway through, a new sound entered the track: rhythmic, slow, unmistakably patterned. 7 beats. Pause. 7 more. Barris thought it was dripping water until Leach said, "That's under us." The recording ends with that line. When they replayed the cylinder the next morning, the sound was gone, replaced by faint static and what seemed like whispered counting. Barris dismissed it as surface wear. Leach was less certain. Returning to Knoxville, he delivered his prints to the regional archive. The 3 frames containing the figure were immediately rejected as flawed exposures. Weeks later, when a technician attempted to reproduce them, the negatives discolored, first bronze, then opaque gray, as if light itself had withdrawn. The storage clerk who handled them described a burnt sugar odor rising from the chemicals. Leach continued his assignments across the South, though friends later remarked he grew increasingly wary of empty land. His logbook ends abruptly in 1938 with a final entry: "Do not go back when it hums." That same year, a small feature in the Chattanooga Times mentioned a fire at the temporary WPA office in Cleveland, Tennessee. Dozens of glass negatives were lost, including those from Claymore Valley. The fire's origin was officially listed as chemical reaction in storage bath. But a marginal note by the city fire chief reads, "Flame started from sealed cabinet. No ignition source." The story might have ended there, if not for a rediscovery in 1979. When an archivist named Olivia Trent found Leach's original field log among surplus government papers. Alongside it lay a single surviving contact print, small, faded, yet unmistakable. The image showed the valley at dawn, mist curling like smoke. At the frame's right edge, a faint shape of a woman's silhouette stood facing the camera, arms slightly raised. When Trent enlarged the print, she noticed something else behind the figure. Barely visible in the haze were 6 darker shapes spaced evenly in a curve. 7 in all. The print was authenticated and stored in climate control, catalogued as Federal Writers' Project. Claymore Hollow, unexhibited. In 1984, a photographic historian attempted to restabilize the print using modern emulsions. Under ultraviolet light, he discovered faint writing across the lower border, previously invisible to the naked eye. It read, "They said the quiet was their gift." The handwriting did not match Leach's notes. Today, the photograph remains locked in archival storage. A digital copy circulates among researchers of early Southern photography, though it resists high-resolution scanning. The figure always fades first, as if dissolving into the pixels. When questioned about the image, archivist Trent once remarked to a colleague, "Every time we bring it up on screen, the lights in the room flicker, exactly 7 times. No one has disproven her claim." By the turn of the century, references to a traveling sect known only as the Quiet Order had become an undercurrent in Appalachian rumor, spoken of in fireside whispers and faded church ledgers. Their name appeared in passing, often scratched in margins. The quiet came after the rain. It wasn't until 1909 that a researcher, Dr. Lionel Crutch, a folklorist from the University of the South in Sewanee, began collecting testimonies. Crutch, intrigued by stories of the 7 singers of Claymore, traced oral accounts from elderly congregants scattered across Tennessee's hill country. His notebooks, preserved in the university archive, reveal that the order's presence coincided with the aftermath of the 1882 southern United States floods, the same event that erased county records and unearthed the Shepherd property. Crutch described them as a band of plain, dressed revivalists, unordained, unarmed, carrying staffs wrapped in white cloth. They claimed no church and left no records except for their songs. Melancholy, droning hymns that emphasized silence between verses more than the words themselves. He recorded one verse from a witness named Eleanor Prout. 7 fall, 7 rise, water takes, earth replies. Quiet hands, steady breath, seal the soil, delay the death. When Crutch asked what the words meant, Prout replied, "They sang for the drowned ones, to keep them from waking." Crutch's notes reveal he began to suspect that the order had been summoned, or at least tolerated, by local officials to sanctify or contain certain disaster sites. A clerk in Hamilton County allegedly paid them from unaccounted flood relief funds, just as James Keaton's 1887 affidavit implied. In his later field report, Crutch wrote, "If they were not a church, then they were something older. A society of sealing. A covenant with the quiet itself." In 1911, he traveled to the ruins of Claymore Valley, guided by a descendant of one of the Shepherd neighbors. The man refused to enter the depression, saying only, "They warned us. The silence keeps it down." Crutch ventured alone. What he found became the core of his unpublished manuscript, The Breath Beneath. According to his notes, the valley floor was soft, unnaturally cool, and laced with small fissures that exhale like lips underwater. He placed a phonograph horn over one of the openings and recorded what he heard. The cylinder, now lost, was described in his notes as containing a measured exhalation, steady and warm, as if from lungs too large for any creature. He returned shaken, insisting he'd found physical evidence of what the order had sealed. Over the following months, he sent letters to various theological societies seeking insight. Most dismissed his claims, but one response arrived anonymously, postmarked from Chattanooga. "You found what they buried. It is not theirs, nor ours. Leave it to its quiet." Crutch ignored the warning. In 1912, he lectured privately in Sewanee to a small circle of students. One attendee's recollection decades later described Crutch showing the audience a wax rubbing of a handprint. 7 fingers, long and spindly, taken from the underside of a limestone slab he'd unearthed near the old Shepherd site. 3 days after the lecture, Crutch was found unconscious in his study, all windows sealed, phonograph still turning. He survived but never spoke again. The wax rubbing vanished from the archive soon afterward. Students who catalogued his effects years later noted that every notebook of his from that expedition contained the same ink notation on the final page. They listened from underneath. Following Crutch's collapse, the university quietly closed its folklore department for budgetary reasons. His notes were boxed and forgotten until the 1970s, when they resurfaced during a digitization project. One intern who handled the papers reported a vibrating hum when scanning certain pages, though this was likely mechanical. Still, the pattern of sevens persisted throughout his material: 7 hymns, 7 hand-drawn symbols, 7 recorded localities where the order was seen. Every account described their arrival immediately after a flood, their silence, and their departure before sunrise. Folklorists today debate whether the quiet order ever truly existed. Some suggest they were no more than an invention of rural ministers to explain the persistence of death in the wake of the floods. A moral metaphor for letting the past lie. Others see their trail through Tennessee and northern Georgia as tangible, remnants of an early ritual movement obsessed with keeping something beneath the ground. Yet the parallels remain impossible to ignore. Each recorded appearance aligns geographically with towns where subsidence, sinkholes, or unexplained tremors followed within a year. In Claymore's case, the land still breathes after rain, a motion caught even on modern seismographs, low and regular, like a pulse. In the valley, few speak of the order now, though one elderly resident told a journalist in 1998, "They weren't saving us. They were keeping the noise quiet, for a price." That phrase, "for a price," matches exactly the final line written in the Ledger of Silence: "The quiet is the debt." And so, the circle closes: the floods, the ledgers, the 7 graves, the order that sang only in silence. Whether they buried the shepherds, or something older that borrowed their names, remains unknown. All we know is that silence still settles there faster than fog, and sometimes, just before it does, the wind passes through the hollow with a sound like breathing. By the winter of 1915, the Claymore Valley tract was once again listed for sale, a formality handled by the Hamilton County Office of Lands and Estates. The survey map drawn that December contained a faint notation in the lower margin: ground subject to intermittent seepage. Depth inconsistent. No one bid. The land was later leased for timber, but the crews never finished their first season. The foreman, Elias Turner, filed a brief statement dated March 4, 1916, in which he complained that the men could not hold footing nor axes steady, owing to a murmuring through the soil. He later described a regular motion underfoot, as if the ground swelled with trapped air. Turner's report was dismissed as exaggeration, though 3 laborers quit within the same week, walking the entire distance to Chattanooga rather than spend another night in the hollow. They told a local innkeeper they'd heard the counting voices, a phrase that appears in no other surviving record. At this same time, the Southern Geological Review published an article concerning low resonance tremors recorded across Tennessee's floodplains, attributing them to residual subsidence from the 1882 southern United States floods. The author, Professor Gideon Hale, specifically mentioned the Claymore Basin, writing that the land there appears to breathe, exhaling moisture in regular cadence with temperature shifts. It was likely a coincidence, but those familiar with the shepherd legend noticed how the description mirrored old oral accounts of Earth that size. Around that same period, an aging constable named Rufus Klein, retired but still occasionally consulted, sent a letter to the Chattanooga Times. It was never printed but preserved in the paper's correspondence files. His handwriting was shaky, but his intent clear. "They called me there when they first found the graves years ago. Said it was murder. I say it was a keeping. That ground ain't evil, it's working, like lungs work. Only thing evil is disturbing it," no official ever answered. By 1918, Hale's academic theory that trapped gases caused the valley's strange breathing was widely accepted. Yet one of his graduate assistants, Marion Overstreet, later admitted that when they placed barometers across the site, the readings pulsed, not randomly, but rhythmically, once every 27 seconds. In her private diary, now archived in Knoxville, she added a line that scholars rarely quote. "We thought the ground was venting, but it felt more like it was waiting." Within the same year, Hale's team suspended further fieldwork due to what they called equipment losses from environmental instability. Unofficially, their camp had been raided by locals who claimed the scientists were uncovering sealed ground. The phrase sealed ground soon reappeared in Tennessee folklore, migrating from town to town. In sermons, it became a warning against digging too deep, both literally and morally. Some even tied the story to broader rural cautionary tales, a habit of linking sin to soil, as if the earth itself remembered wrongs better than men did. But a few continued to investigate quietly. One was Dr. Eliza Granger, a rural physician whose great-uncle had been the coroner in the original Shepherd case. She inherited a box of his notes and began comparing them to geological reports. Her surviving papers, housed in the State Historical Society, include an extraordinary annotation, same pattern in all 7 graves, compacted sediment, uniform compression from beneath, not above. It was a detail others had overlooked. Her conclusion, scribbled in pencil at the bottom of a ledger page, reads simply, "They were not buried, they were pressed upward." Granger's colleagues dismissed the observation as misinterpretation. Nevertheless, in 1921 she revisited the site herself, accompanied by 2 attendants. According to her field report, all that remained of the Shepherd property was a single foundation stone, half sunk in clay. On its underside, she claimed to have found faint impressions resembling fingerprints, 7 in a neat arc, long and uneven. She made a charcoal rubbing and sent it to the university at Sewanee for comparison with Crutch's earlier accounts. The sample never arrived. A flood followed 2 weeks later, washing through the valley, destroying Granger's camp. Her body was recovered 5 miles downstream. The attendant survived but refused to speak publicly, except for one line reported by the county sheriff. The ground spoke to her. After that, the Claymore Hollow tract was condemned as unsuitable for habitation. Nature, or something like it, reclaimed the rest. Trees grew crooked there, twisting in the direction of the wind's fall, and the air remained perpetually cool even in July. Yet old-timers said you could still find the Shepherd Foundation if you knew where to look. They described it as marked not by stone but by absence, a patch of earth that swallowed sound. Hunters who ventured too close claimed they could hear a low hum, like someone whispering under layers of earth. Whether caused by air pockets, underground streams, or some unspoken remnant of the Shepherd family's secret, no one knows. The 1882 floods, the Quiet Order, the Ledger of Silence, Dr. Crutch's collapse, and Dr. Granger's drowning all seem threads in the same fabric, woven too deep to unpick. By 1925, the last official mention of the Shepherd case appeared in a small regional journal, dismissed as rural myth and repetition. Yet, the editor's note carried one curious addendum. Strange that the hollows of Tennessee should breathe so, and stranger still that no one remembers what they're sighing for. Even now, when the weather changes suddenly, the valley exhales. Locals say it smells faintly of iron, of turned soil, after a grave is opened. And those who linger too long sometimes hear that counting again, soft, patient, and low 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. By 1928, maps of the region no longer marked Claymore Valley by name. The hollows had been absorbed into private timberland, then left fallow. Only the oldest residents used the name anymore, usually in lowered voices, as if the sound itself might stir something best left still. In an archived county record dated October 3, 1929, a surveyor named Walter Haynes noted in his field log, "No birds at the center of the tract. Compass unreliable. Air unnaturally dense." Haynes never filed his final report. His notebook, found later in a locked drawer at the county office, ended mid-sentence, just after a line describing a hollow tone beneath the boots. The silence that had once been rumor became a sort of inheritance. Children were warned not to wander beyond the ridge where the land listened. Hunters avoided the basin entirely. Even in years of drought, the soil stayed moist there, as though it were watered from below. The few who passed through claimed that on overcast evenings the air trembled, not in sound, but in pressure, like breath pushing outward from under the ground. And if you waited long enough, they said, you might hear the faint echo of a woman's voice, reciting in rhythm with the earth's pulse 7 fall, 7 rise. Some called it superstition. Others said it was just the sound of trapped air escaping from caverns beneath the limestone. But those who studied the old records knew that the 1882 southern United States floods had never quite receded here. They had sunk into the land, left behind not water but memory. When Dr. Lionel Crutch's sealed archive was finally opened to the public in 1930, a single page from his missing manuscript surfaced, tucked inside a geological journal donated by an anonymous estate. It read, "What they sealed was not death. It was interruption. The air below belongs to them still." The pronoun was never clarified. That same year, a preacher in a nearby town held a revival service titled, "The Quiet Debt." He told his congregation that sin never dies. It only sleeps beneath the flood line. A storm rolled in that night, washing half the cemetery fence away. In the morning, 7 graves were found disturbed, though the earth around them remained untouched. The county blamed erosion. The townsfolk simply nailed the gates shut. By the mid-1930s, the story of the Shepherd family had devolved into folklore. Campfire talk for boys testing their courage, or late-night warnings for travelers along the river road. Yet a few fragments of the truth persisted, scattered like bones in a plowed field. One was the ledger discovered by the minister's widow. Another was the rubbing of the 7-fingered handprint that passed through several private collections before disappearing in 1941. A third, perhaps most disturbing, was the phonograph cylinder from Crutch's expedition, mislabeled in a Chattanooga archive as "Flood Sounds." Tennessee, 1911. When played decades later, it contained no hymn, no voice, only a slow inhalation and exhalation, steady, rhythmic, unmistakably human. The archivist who catalogued it described feeling dizzy, as though the room itself drew breath. The recording has since been lost, misfiled or deliberately removed, but the accession number remains, like a scar in the catalog sequence. Folklorists occasionally revisit the story, tracing its details back to verifiable sources: the 1882 floods, the Shepherd property sale, the constable's testimony, the geological anomalies. Each thread checks out. Yet, when woven together, they form a pattern that refuses neat conclusion. Something was buried in Tennessee Hollow, perhaps guilt, perhaps grief, perhaps something older still. And every attempt to expose it ended with silence. Locals today still claim that on humid nights, the hollow exhales. Some hikers report fog lifting from the ground in smooth, round columns, as if shaped by invisible lungs. Others hear nothing at all, but leave uneasy, feeling watched by something patient beneath the soil. The valley remains uninhabited. No houses stand there now, no fences, no graves visible, only the impression of a foundation stone that sinks deeper with each passing year. The air is cooler there than anywhere else in Hamilton County. Instruments can't hold a reading for long. If you walk down at dusk and stand quietly enough, you may notice the way sound seems to fold inward, as if the hollow itself were listening. And if you whisper, really whisper, you might hear your words come back to you, slightly altered, as though spoken by another mouth just under the ground. Old men in nearby towns still speak of the Shepherd family in half-believing tones. They say their tragedy was not murder or madness, but a pact, a bargain struck when the floodwaters came, to keep something submerged in exchange for peace. 7 wives, 7 graves, 7 seals. Whether you believe that or not, the result is the same. The land holds its breath, and every few decades someone disturbs it. A surveyor, a geologist, a wanderer looking for old stories. The endings never change. The records always fade, and the silence returns, deeper than before. So if you ever find yourself near Claymore Valley, stand still for a moment. Listen to the quiet. If the air feels heavy, if the wind seems to stop mid-motion, don't wait for it to pass. Leave while you can. Because some debts, once whispered to the ground, are never truly paid, only delayed. And beneath the hollows of Tennessee, The earth still remembers how to breathe.